Following Dr. No, Bond producers sought to decide which Fleming novel to adapt next. Because President John F. Kennedy named the novel From Russia with Love as one of his top 10 favorites, Bond producers opted to adapt it. It also was apparently the last film that President Kennedy ever saw before his death. The film follows Bond in the midst of the Cold War with an attempt to attain a Lecter decoder, a piece of machinery used to decode hidden messages from the Russians. This search happens through the intervention of Spectre, the organization Dr. No was a part of, as a means to extort the Russians and humiliate Bond for killing their operative. Unlike the more traditional Bond film, which contains a large, epic, and outlandish plot, this film goes for the more traditional espionage spy thriller, and I personally think it's a nice change. Despite this, the film contains a lot of firsts that would be carried on into the series. The film begins with the traditional gun barrel from the previous film for the first time with the accompanying Bond theme. This is followed by the first pre-title sequence in a Bond film. It introduces one of the main henchmen of the film, Donald Grant, who is seen killing a man disguised as Bond. This is followed by the title sequence, which features the title shown on a belly dancer doing her thing. Note that the title sequence weren't designed by film regular Maurice Binder, but by someone named Robert Brownjohn, who also did the titles to Goldfinger. Personally, while his titles were pretty innovative, they pale in comparison to what we saw from Binder and Dr. No, or what we'll see in the post-Goldfinger films. I do, however, consider the musical score by series regular John Barry, however, to be a vast improvement over the score in Dr. No by Monty Norman, which consisted primarily of dated incidental music, while this film has a more dynamic orchestral music. The film goes on to introduce members of Spectre, including Kronstein, aka Number 5, and the inspiration for Austin Powers' Frau Farbissina, Rosa Klebb, aka Number 3. It also introduces Spectre's leader, Number 1, whose unseen appearance is credited as Ernst Blofeld with a question mark. And I've got to admit, this guy is pretty intimidating. I guess not seeing his face gives him an air of mystery and discomfort. Not to mention the fact that from their first scene with him, his members are pretty damn scared of him. It seems almost as if to say the wrong thing or act the wrong way in front of this guy would result in death, but attempting to leave might result in the same thing, so they're stuck. Pretty good for someone you never see. Neat bit of trivia though, this unseen Number 1 is played by Anthony Dawson, who played Professor Dent in Dr. No. One thing uncommon in this Bond film is the fact that they hold off showing their main protagonist until about 18 minutes in. Sure, we got to see Connery in the pre-title sequence, but he didn't say anything, and turns out he wasn't Bond. In those 18 minutes, the filmmakers wisely developed the supporting cast. We get the intimidating Blofeld, the cold calculating Kronstein, the scary Klebb, and we get our first look at the film's female lead, Tatiana Romanova, played by Daniela Bianchi. I like her a lot as a Bond girl. Unlike Honey Rider, whose primary purpose was window dressing for the film Dr. No, Tanya actually serves a purpose in this film. In fact, a great deal of the plot revolves around her connection to the Lecter. We get a lot out of her character in her first few scenes. We get to know her particularly well in her scene with Klebb. There's a definite contrast between these two characters. The young, naive, innocent cipher clerk and the much older, more experienced and downright scary head of Smersh. We learn that Tanya is a patriot for her country and would go so far as to seduce a man for it. We also learn that she's someone who's a victim to her passions as someone who has a tendency to fall in love rather quickly.
Then you have had the 3 love.
I was in love.
And if you were not in love?
I suppose it would depend on the man.
These aspects of her personality come into conflict in the climactic scene of the film, where she has to choose between someone she fell in love with and her country. Though she does overall fall into the needy, along-for-the-ride group of Bond girls, she definitely holds her own as a unique and likable character. We finally get to Bond, whose first scene is with a familiar face from Dr. No, Sylvia Trench, who ended up being the only Bond girl character to be shown in more than one film. In fact, the producers considered having her be Bond's recurring girlfriend, who would become the main Bond girl of a film later down the line. But this idea was dropped in Goldfinger when we see the character of Dink. I really don't need to say much about Connery. It seems he's grown more comfortable in the role of Bond. He definitely shows more confidence than he did in the previous film. He's charming, cool, funny, and menacing when he needs to be. Everything that makes Bond, Bond. Another great addition to the cast is Pedro Armendáriz as Ali Karim Bey. He plays an almost father-like character to Bond, not dissimilar to Mark Ange Draco from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And this guy's just downright cool. He's in control of a vast network of information and acts as a liaison to the West because he's bored with selling rugs.
My friend, you should be a mind reader.
He shows ignoring his aroused girlfriend because he's busy, but goes ahead with sleeping with her just to calm her down, a situation he likens to working in the salt mines. There's also a running joke that all the people he works with are his sons. There's even a scene where he and Bond are afraid they're about to be seen by the police, but it turns out they're his sons. Unfortunately, Armendáriz was near death during filming and died soon after shooting his scenes. Another first this film has is the gadget briefing scene with Q, who's played here for the first time by Desmond Llewellyn as Major Boothroyd, who's the same character seen in Dr. No, giving Bond his signature Walther PPK. Here we learn about Bond's attaché case, which has an arsenal of gadgets. It should be noted, though, these gadgets are very believable. You could imagine almost any real-life spy using a tool like this. They thankfully don't take the gadget thing too far in this film like they would in future films. In this case, it's the first time the Chekhov's gun technique is used with these gadgets, which is a good lead-in to the fight on the Orient Express. So here, Donald Grant seems to have the drop on Bond, and his plan seems to have gone through well. He has Bond, the girl, the Lecter, video evidence to humiliate Bond, and his own brute strength. Donald Grant plays kind of a foil to Bond. They're both small men in their respective groups, but they're also very necessary. Grant previously demonstrated his abilities by quickly killing or subduing anyone who gets in his way. He kills Karim Bey and another man, making it look like they killed each other. He even gets hit in the ribs with brass knuckles without even flinching. This is one tough bastard, and he's gotten Bond at his most vulnerable. The verbal play in between them reveals a lot about them. There were also implications that Bond was actually in love with Tanya. You can see the wheels turning in Bond's head as he realizes he's screwed, and he has near futile attempts at finding an opportunity to get out of it. He eventually does when he makes not so conventional use of the 50 gold sovereigns by taking advantage of Grant's greed. Here the use of the attaché case begins with the exploding talcum powder and finishing with the knife. The fight itself is very brutal for a 1963 film, and there were even attempts to censor it because it was so violent. The film does have its shortcomings. There is a scene where Bond and Bey visit a gypsy camp, and there's a lot of time spent on a conflict between two gypsy women fighting over a man. In the end, Bond is left to decide the matter with kinda unexplained results. I understand it was put in the film because it was in the novel, and it was a nice segue into the Krylenko subplot, but too much time was spent in the camp. If you look at some of the scenes for the first time, you'd be surprised it was part of a Bond film. The other shortcoming would kind of be the tacked-on action scenes in the climax to Venice. They were kind of unnecessary, and if you skipped them, you wouldn't miss much plot-wise. It seemed as if they were just putting the action scenes in out of obligation because the film was so dialogue and plot-heavy. And a note on the helicopter scene. Sean Connery was actually almost killed when the helicopter flew too close. To draw them away from Tanya and the truck, Bond grabs the Lecter and runs. Failing to run Bond down, the pilots try to drop a grenade on Bond. But this kind of defeats their purpose since they want the Lecter to extort the Russians, and dropping the grenade would probably destroy it. These things aside, I love this film. It's my personal favorite in the series, and apparently it's Sean Connery's too. I guess I think it's kind of nice to see a more typical spy thriller to contrast the outlandish elements that would become a staple of the series. It has strong characters, a great plot, and it manages to keep my attention without shoving action scenes in my face. So overall, great film.